Well, hi, Life Group leaders. I want you to take your Bible with me this morning, and I want you to turn to Job chapter 38, but our lesson text is chapter 40. It's lesson number 6, and our writers have kind of concentrated on the first few verses of chapter 40. Let me just kind of tell you that I'm going to do something a little different in this lesson. I'm teaching this Sunday. And I always try to be kind of pointed, 1, 2, 3, 4. But as I studied out the passage and tried to put some thoughts down, it didn't really turn out that way. And so just kind of walk along with me and Richard, and maybe we'll give you some things you can take and use. But maybe not, and that's okay too, okay? Finally, in this saga of pain and bewilderment, God speaks. And does he ever? Have you ever been in a discussion or maybe in an argument and things don't go real well, and partway through this discussion you're having maybe with your spouse or whatever, you're thinking, I should have just kept my mouth shut. Well, welcome to Job, because Job at some point in this thing, and you'll see in chapter 40, he says basically, man, should have kept my mouth shut. Not a good idea, okay? I'm just going to jump in. Richard, you inject whenever you're ready or at the end or however, because we kind of, I think, are going to look at this maybe a little different. And so I think you'll be able to maybe grab some things from me and grab some things from Richard that you can develop for your class. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a few moments of review, because I think it will lead into some of the things that I'm going to teach this week in my lesson. Last week, we met an interesting character by the name of Elihu. Elihu was interesting. He was confusing to us, I think, at least was for my class. Some of the times as you read what he wrote, you thought, wow, that's good, and that makes a lot of sense. Then other times it made you scratch your head and you think, well, I'm not sure that's exactly right. Here's what Nick Barner taught our lesson last week. He just did a wonderful job. And here's kind of where our class kind of ended up. We feel like that Elihu was trying to get Job to shift from himself and his pain and to focus on God and his glory and power. In fact, Nick in his lesson even suggested that Elihu was trying to get Job to realize, Job, if you'd quit focusing on yourself and focus more on God, then this pain that you're going through would get over with, or maybe if you would have done it earlier, it wouldn't have lasted as long. And I think that's got a lot of merit, okay? Now, I think one of the questions, if you take that approach, and I think that's valid. I don't know how you looked at it, Richard, but that made a lot of sense to me, because Elihu was a little bit of confusion to us. But the question, I guess, is if you took that kind of approach, then does that mean that Elihu thought that Abraham sinned? And I don't know that you could read that in the text. I certainly don't think that that Job sinned there. I think that he was just intensely human. I think that Job, as he walked through the pain cycle, was doing what we all do. He was focusing on his pain. He was hurting. He had gone through something that most of us have never gone through and certainly don't want to go through. But when we go through pain, we tend to focus on our misery, and we tend to get kind of introverted or introspective, maybe is a better term, on ourselves. But I don't think we could call it sin, because Job, if you remember, held very doggedly to his faith. He never gave up on God. He just couldn't quite understand it, and he couldn't make sense out of it, okay? However, one thing we can learn is this, that when we shift our focus from ourself to God, when we shift from our personal circumstances over to God's attributes or God's character, then we can find healing, spiritual healing, emotional healing, Because the question moves from, God, why are you doing this? Or God, why are you allowing it? To God, what are you doing here? And what's the purpose of what you're doing? And it helps us realize that God is in control and God does rule. Therefore, God has a purpose in that which comes into our lives, even the pain. We don't like the pain, but especially in the pain, we can ask ourselves, God, what are you doing? I thought it a little ironic for me that when I was studying out the passage and trying to get where I could write out what I was going to teach this Sunday, I got the call that Daniel Roberts, one of our church members, had passed away from COVID. As you probably know, maybe have prayed for, Daniel has been very sick with COVID over the last month or so. And I just loved Daniel. I got to lead him to the Lord and baptized he and led his wife and kids to the Lord and got the joy of being with them over these last few years. And, it's just one of those bewildering things. Your heart just breaks. And it's be easy for us to say, God, why? But if we could do, as Job finally gets to the point of doing, saying, God, what? Then we can see perhaps that God knows what he's doing, even though we don't understand it, even though he doesn't explain it, and even though we may not like it, okay? So what I think is important here is that as God responds, as God speaks, Job realizes his situation or the situation he was in, his circumstance, was not the most important issue, but that God was. And even though he may have had moments where he wondered where God was, he comes to realize is that God is always where he always is. He's on his throne, he's ruling, and he's controlling every event of life. He's sovereign. He knows no explanations. He oftentimes doesn't give any answers. In fact, now that God responds in chapter 38, he, beginning in chapter 38, he never explains his actions, okay? Now, before I move on, Richard, I don't know if you got anything you want to throw in there?
Just as an overview, you were talking about Job questioning God and whatnot. The way I kind of read these questions, especially in verses, 6 to 14, it was almost as if Job had been expressing what I think we have all thought at some point in our lives, perhaps especially when we were younger. Well, I could do that better. Mm-hmm. And it might have been our first boss for our first job. We seem to know how to do everything better. Or it might be if it was me as a coach of that team, as I sit in my easy chair and watch it, well, I would have done this, as if I would know better. Mm-hmm. And I think as we get into these verses, what God expresses in these verses is pretty much, in my view anyway, if you think you could do better, have at it. Yeah. And be careful what you ask for. And as we move through it, I'll share with you another scripture where we see that again. Good. And it's something that we need to think about as we even, we can question God, but ultimately we have to trust God.
That's right.
But that's the only thing I would add at this point.
That's good. Okay. Well, God finally breaks the silence. Our lesson is Job 40, but God actually begins speaking in chapter 38. And I want to encourage you, at least for yourself, to go back to chapter 38, begin there. And I'm going to do that in my teaching lesson Sunday. I'm going to start in chapter 38, okay? And this is where I said earlier, Job realizes he should have kept his mouth shut because no one can really answer God. Now, let me just kind of mention to you, chapter 38 through chapter 41, we have two speeches. Some call it two cycles of speeches by God. There's 77 questions that are fired at Job in rapid fire like a machine gun order, okay? It's like bam, 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 bam. It keeps hitting Job, and you can just, and at least in my mind, I see Job kind of shrinking, thinking, oh man, why didn't I just shut up here? Why did I keep going on and on and on, okay? These are rapid fire questions. There's some commentary by God in them, But these 77 questions are really what's called rhetorical in nature. In other words, God's shooting these questions out to Job, but he doesn't really want an answer. He doesn't expect an answer. So while they are indeed questions, they're more statements by God because of him trying to help Job realize, hey, I'm God, and I don't have to explain anything to anybody. And Job finally gets it. He realizes that he's not God's equal. He realizes that he's inadequate to defend his circumstance. And by the way, life group leaders, this might be a good place to have a discussion or bring out a discussion questions, because when you're in pain, it's hard to realize that, hey, we're not equal to God. And Richard said it just right. There just comes times, especially in the valleys of life, when you've just got to trust God, even though you're confused, and even though you don't understand, and even though you don't like it, okay? Now, the question comes up, what's the difference? If there's two cycles, then what's the difference in the two cycles? Well, let me throw something out for you to chew on, okay? The first response by God challenges Job's presumption of God's knowledge. And he'll list a lot of the nature and things like that. Okay, created order, I think it's some say. The second is Job's presumption of God's justice. In the first, God basically asks, does the one who is created have a right to question the one who creates? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. Obviously, the answer would be no. You don't even have to answer it because it's obviously no. In the second, the question is, does anyone dare question the righteousness or the justice of God? And again, that's a rhetorical question because the answer is obviously no. Okay? Let me throw out a couple things that I thought were pretty cool, okay? And that's why I want you to have your Bible open and turn to chapter 38, okay? Both times, in both of these cycles or speeches, God begins to speak with the same things. Let's look at 38, verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now notice what he says. Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Okay? And then he starts these rapid fire questions. Turn to chapter 40, which is our lesson text. And let's read verses 6 through 8. We'll get back to verse 1 in a minute. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, now gird up your loins like a man. I will ask you, and you instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Okay? And I thought that was a good way to start. It was kind of very striking that God started with his answers, the challenges back to Job the same way. Here's another cool thing. Job's problems all began in a storm, right? You remember chapter 1? Okay? Well, God's answers are in the storm as well. In chapter 38, verse 1, it's the word whirlwind. That's the same word that's used in Jonah that means a mighty tempest. But it's also the same word that's used in chapter 40, verse 6. And so this first cycle helps Job realize that no one can challenge the Creator. And so when we come to chapter 40, Job smartly says, chapter 40, beginning verse 3, then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer, even twice, and I will add nothing more. And I can't help but wonder, Richard, if Job is thinking back to all of that he had mentioned and talked about and gone through and all that, he probably wishes, I wish I had just put my hand to my mouth and hushed earlier. Now, let me ask you, did you catch the shift here? did you? From internal pain to upward awe. You see, maybe one reason we suffer so much is that our views are on ourselves, not God. And if we could shift our views from ourselves to God, then maybe, I think probably, we could find some healing, okay? Now, that's kind of, I'm going to jump and let Richard jump in. I'll come back with some thoughts. But that's what my lesson's going to be. As you notice, I didn't deal with all these verses because they're all part of some questions and statements and commentary by God. But you may want to do that, and I think Richard may do a little bit of that. But Richard, why don't you jump in, then I'll come back and close out some of my thoughts, okay?
Yeah, one of these things is God is speaking to Job, and as Job has spoken to God previously, if you look in Mark 10, verses 35 to 40, and you know the story, where James and John have quite a request, arrogant request of God. One wants to sit on his right, and one wants to sit on his left. And, of course, what is Jesus' rebuke to that, or answer to that, is you have no idea what you are asking.
Yeah.
And it's with respect to the questioning that Job does to God, and God's response is, you have no idea what you're talking about or what's involved in trying to justify yourself and annul my justice. As I heard one person put it, you can put on the robe, but that doesn't make you a judge. It doesn't make you wise. Wow. And the other thing that struck me about this is, we always go through chapters like this in the Old Testament sometimes, which is a little harder than maybe the New Testament. But one of the things we got to remember is we need to remember who God is and have that reverence for Him. But remember, too, who He is speaking to. We're talking about Job, who was a very wise, influential, and accomplished person in his day. So, sometimes we revere those people that are successful on so many levels, or seem to be. But God was even speaking to him like this with 77 questions. So you put into that equation ourselves. And I don't know about you all, but I'm surely not as accomplished as Job ever was, nowhere near it. So who am I to question God? And so you kind of look at yourself in the context not only of who God is, but who He was speaking to. Wow. And it kind of humbles you. And when we see, again, who God was speaking to. There's a bit of sarcasm, I think, that God uses, if I can use that word, when He says in verse 8, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? And again, do you think you could do better? And when you mentioned 77 rhetorical questions are not meant to be answered because you can answer them yourself. Just by the fact that they're asked, the answer becomes self-evident. And I can imagine Job hearing all these questions and going, he's right, he's right, he's right.
That's right.
And so I think that's important to point out. If, again, a New Testament reference, Mark 10, 35 to 40, I think is a good point to start there.
Good.
So,
okay. If you were sharing that, I got to thinking, when we're in discussion, well, at least my nature is to interrupt. Paula lets me know that when I'm talking to someone, I don't ever let them finish their sentence before I'm already giving an answer or interrupting or whatever. But God didn't do that with Job. It's kind of cool. Of course, God's God, and He's awfully patient, or we'd all be dead, right? But it's just like God just sitting back, and maybe sarcasm, you said, or maybe a little bit of I don't know what God, He's God, but, He's just letting Job go through all of this, and He's just kind of letting it happen. He didn't interrupt him. He doesn't interject Himself until all of these friends and all of these things, and then God, it's like, okay, now, hear me, Job. And then He jumps in. I thought about that as you were sharing all that. Now, here's what I'm going to do at the end of this little lesson with my class. I'm going to say, I think we must ask ourselves, what can I get from all of this? Now, I jotted down 7 things I'm going to shoot out to you, and then we'll let Richard maybe finish this up, okay? Number 1, in a storm, run to God's character. Okay? Run to the attributes of God. Dwell on God. Let Him be the shelter, because most of the time we just don't understand. Number 2, if we ask why, we may stay confused. But if we shift to God's sovereignty, then we ask what I said earlier, what? And we seek purpose. And we can get the answer every time. Why? Because His purpose and everything that He does is for His glory. And so we ask, what are you doing? And our answer is, He's doing it for His glory. Number 3, and this may be a little bit of a challenge to you. Okay? 3 and 4 may be a little bit of a challenge. Number 3, evil things, or perhaps better said, bad things. But let's stay with evil things. Evil things always has limits. You see, God at some point will say, enough. This far and no more. So that leads me to number 4. Evil has its place in our lives because we're part of God's created order, and because He pushes us to Him, He who created the order in the first place, and all of created order is subject to Him. I was reading one of the commentaries, Richard. It's kind of interesting. One put it this way, and this may challenge all of us. Evil is God's baby. In order evil not to threaten us, we have to realize evil doesn't threaten God no more than a baby threatens, and a baby's bad behavior threatens the parents. So that's why He said evil is God's baby. Somewhat challenging, but it's interesting. Number 5, we would rather God speak in the sunshine, wouldn't we? But we hear better in the storm. Number 6, the power and justice of God is unquestionable and always is operative in every storm because it's His right and His rule, and they are supreme. And then number 7, and we'll see this next week, the end is always better than the beginning for God's children. And next week we will conclude our study of Job, and we'll see the end is always better than the beginning. Well, Richard, that's kind of what I'm going to do, and I like some of the things you said. I'm going to incorporate it. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
Just a couple. I think that what this reminds us of is the awesomeness of God. We talk about that a lot, but, when things come to us that we don't want to have come to us, or we would rather not, sometimes we question Him, but we don't need to presume that we know better than Him, and we don't need to presume that we will ever understand all of it. And as I mentioned earlier, we just need to trust Him. As I've observed, certainly in my life, and perhaps you all have too in your life, when you go through difficult times or affliction, that's when you learn more than you do in affluence or the good times. So I think that, one of the things I've shared with my class is when the 3 friends, went through the series of speeches with Job, they seem to have a lot of easy answers for difficult questions that Job had. And we may not be able to find the answer except in God and His power and His purpose and His provision until we just say, I don't know, I can't understand it, but I will someday. God has an infinite view of things.
That's right. We
tend to view things in our own range of experience. And when we're suffering, we may have people around us, but it is a lonely place to be.
Amen.
But there in that suffering, God is as present, and if He could be even more in our suffering, if we will just look and listen to Him and trust Him. And I think that's the message here in his response to Job's questions.
That's good. So. Thank you, Richard. Life Group leaders, one thing you may want to think about, and even share with your students is to remind them, they know this, but you might want to remind them that God lives in the eternal present. There is no past, present, future tense with God. And so God in his ability to, the transcendency of God, to look down on us, he's looking at our lives in one look. There's a moment you were born, and there's this moment that you die, and there's all of this in between, the hills and the valleys, the good and the bad, the tears and the triumphs. But God's seeing it at all at one time. And, if we could somehow, I think, get ourselves to capture that. I don't know how you do it, because when you're in pain, you don't think about that. But just remember, eternal presence of God. He sees it all. Therefore, what's happening in this life and then death, in this moment right here, well, he sees this moment. So maybe some things are happening here because of this moment down there. The eternal presence of God. And how comforting, I guess, maybe that could be in our tears. Well, I hope you enjoy the lesson. I'm just glad that God speaks and we get to deal with that just a little bit. Remind you to keep in contact with your students. Tell them how much you love them. Let me ask you to be praying for some in our church who are struggling. As you can imagine, Catherine Roberts is doing exactly what we would do if we lost our spouse. Pray for their 2 girls. Pray comfort for them. They're not going to understand. We don't understand, so therefore they're not. Some of you might remember Annie Doss. Annie and her family moved back to, I think, Arizona, and just wonderful people. Annie's not doing well, and appreciate your prayers for them. Marilyn Corsi is in some rehab, had some surgery, and I think she's doing better. It's going to take her a little bit of time, and of course you've got the folks in your class and in our church and in your family. And so remember to intercede. By the way, I just finished listening to Matt do tape our Wednesday night service, or record. We don't tape anymore. we tape, they don't. Record our Wednesday night service. Did a fabulous job on praying for others. Encourage you to, when Sean gets that out to us, encourage you to maybe listen in to what Matt does, because I thought it was very appropriate to this lesson of Job and some of the life experiences we as a church are going through right now. Well, God bless you. By the way, I don't know if Rich Cal taps into this or not, but it was good to see Rich Cal at church Sunday after his surgery. He looked good. Well, he looked as good as Rich could look. He looked great, and it was good to see him. Well, God bless you. Have a great week.